Well, dear students, today the topic of my talk is ethics in social science research. Ethics are very important because research are activities, especially in social sciences, anthropology, particularly medical sciences, in the field of education, sociology. Researches involve human beings, and there is always a danger of research, although generating a lot of useful ideas, innovations, technologies, but at the same time, there is a danger that research may lead to harm. And in order to provide safety to the participants, in order to provide protection to those who are involved in research, the so-called informant, the so-called subjects, it is important that the research is guided by some regulations, some rules, and some ethical guidelines. Ethic protects people, ethic protects participants. Ethics also provide the necessary guideline or the roadmap to the research. Ethics was never, in the beginning, it was not considered to be a very important activity. But I think as we progress in our research, as we became more concerned about human rights, as we became more concerned about the universal principles of equality and fair play, ethics started coming into research in a more and more important way. So I would like to take you to the journey of social sciences or sciences in general, particularly medical sciences, and how in the beginning we were not very much careful about ethical principles, ethical guidelines, ethical concerns. But over the years, when we started facing the adverse consequences of, of research, sometimes research leading to having clandestine and hidden agenda. So over the years, we became more and more careful, and I think now all the researches are strictly guided by certain principles which have to be followed, which are particularly concerned about protection, safety, and what is called as principle of no harm to the, I would say, innocent, unaware subjects of research. So let me begin by saying why ethics is needed. Research, especially the one involving human subjects, require responsible action on part of the researchers so that the human rights of the subjects or so-called informants are protected. Need for ethical concern arose as the human rights were grossly abused in the name of research in past. And I think the activities in the past are a very, very cruel reminder of the fact that people did not consider subjects as human beings like them. And they treated human beings, I'm talking of human subjects, like guinea pigs. I remember not very long ago, we were having not much ethics as far as the animals are concerned. Animals were considered to be emotionless, almost objects. And I remember when I was a student in the schools and I had biology with me, we used to, put frogs into chloroform and we would then dissect them. And this was considered to be very normal as far as sciences are concerned. But I think there has been a growth, there has been a maturity of how we are going to handle human beings. And now researches are much more ethically appropriate. And the dissections kind of things have almost been banned. Now I would like to quote Albert Einstein, the great scientist of America, who gave theory of relativity. And you know that he was equally concerned about responsible science, about science, of course, not harming humanity. You know what happened in Hiroshima. He said, concern for man himself must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors, in order that the creation of our mind shall be a blessing and not a curse to human. So sometimes what happens, our research becomes a curse to mankind, and our research should be guided by the goal that it should be a blessing, it should lead to welfare. Not only that it should lead to welfare of human beings, it should also not harm them, or minimal harm should be there, or no harm should be there. Now I like to mention some of the classical, I would say, blunders in the name of research. And I think the most prominent of them, of course there are many, is what is called as Tuskegee Study in America. In 1932, the Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute, began a study to record the natural history of syphilis in hope of justifying treatment program for the blacks. It was called Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Males. That was the title of the study. The study initially involved 600 black men, 339 with syphilis and 201 who did not have the disease. The study was conducted without the benefit of patients' informed consent. They were not told about it. Researchers told the men that they were being treated for bad blood, a local name for syphilis. Described several elements including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. In truth, they did not receive the proper treatment needed to cure their illness. In exchange for taking part in the study, the men received free medical exam, free meals, and burial assistance. Although originally projected to last for 6 months, the study actually went on for 40 years. Now, interestingly, there is this assistance that was given for burial, insurance given for burial. Now, there was a hidden agenda here as well. They would conduct post-mortem on the people who died, and then they will try to make observations in various body parts, how syphilis has led to deteriorations, damage to different body parts. Their aim was to understand syphilis. But now what is wrong here? They chose only blacks. Syphilis was there on the whites also, but they discriminated on the basis of race. They only covered the blacks. And secondly, they did not give people, even though the medicine was sometimes available. So they left them because they wanted to understand the natural progression of syphilis at the cost of the life of these 399 black people. This was a grossly inhuman act on these black people. So, in 1972, an Associated Press in America, they gave a story about the Tuskegee Study, and this story caused a public outcry that led the Assistant Secretary of Health and Scientific Affairs in America to appoint an ad hoc advisory panel to review the study. The panel had 9 members from the field of medicine, law, religion, labor, education, health administration, and public affairs. The panel found that men had agreed freely to be examined and treated. However, there was no evidence that researchers had informed them of the study or its real purpose. In fact, the men had been misled and had not been given all the facts required to provide informed consent. They were given false hope. The men were never given adequate treatment for the disease. Even when penicillin became the drug of choice for syphilis, researchers did not offer it to the subjects. and let their condition deteriorate. The advisory panel found nothing to show that subjects were ever given the choice of quitting the study, even when this new highly effective treatment of penicillin became widely used. So, the advisory panel concluded that the Tuskegee study was ethically unjustified. The knowledge gained was sparse when compared with the risk the study posed to its subjects. In fact, the scientists involved in the study, they had at one point of time mentioned that this study will either give them glory or would throw mud on them. Actually, this study did not give them any glory. It was mud spilled over them all over. So in 1974, a 10 million out of court settlement was reached. As part of the settlement, the US government promised to give lifetime medical benefits and burial service to all living participants. The Tuskegee Health Benefit Program, THBP, was established to provide these services. In 1975, wives, widows, and officers of these people were also added to this program. In 1995, the program was expanded to include health as well as medical benefits. I would just like to mention that it led to such an outcry in America that President Bill Clinton himself had to come and seek apologies from these people and from the nation that something wrong was done to them, and he asked for their forgiveness. The another very, very glaring example is, of course, from Germany, and you all are aware of it. It's the Nazi research. The Nazi obsession with purity of race has singularly violated human rights under the guise of scientific research. The establishment of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics in 1927 institutionalized researches oriented towards racial hygienes. Now, this racial obsession was a very, very important obsession with the Nazis, especially Hitler. And he had this false notion that there is something called purity of race, and he had an idea that Aryans are people of pure blood, and therefore non-Aryans, particularly the Jews, are of impure blood. And he wanted to maintain what is called as racial hygiene, so cleaning society of the bad blood. And that fundamental ideas led to all kinds of atrocities on people, led to all kinds of unethical, harmful, dangerous researches on the non-German or non-Aryan people who were considered to be not fit to live. So, the sterilization law was adopted with a view to improve the races by sterilizing the non-German population. This is how it began, racial hygiene. In 1935, they imposed what is called as the Nuremberg Law. The Nuremberg Law had three components meant for cleansing the German population. The racial citizenship law to segregate the pure German blood from the rest. The law for protection of German blood and German honor, which prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. The sexual traffic between German and Jews was regarded as racial pollution. The law for the protection of genetic health of the German people prohibited marriage of those with venereal disease, feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, and other genetic infirmities, so that uncontaminated blood continues to subsequent generations. The sterilization campaign led to sterilization of between 3.5 to 4 lakh people by the year 1939, when it was slowed. The sterilization was replaced later on by euthanasia, which implied killing people. In other words, for the Jews, for the Nazis, it implied sacrificing the life not worth living to the Jews who were considered to be product of racial impurities, the sick, weak, and infirm. Consequently, Euthanasia was implemented by injecting morphines, tablets, and by gassing with cyanide, carbon monoxide, and chemical warfare agents. Now, Nazis indulged in all kinds of biological experiments on human beings, primarily physiological and surgical experiments, which were very, very inhuman, which were very, very cruel, which were very, very torturous. Prisons of the concentration camps, notably Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, were subjected to numerous experiments designed to gain knowledge so as to help the German military. Experiments included injection of seawater, subjection to extreme cold temperature or high or low pressure, bone or limb transplant with medical necessity, injection with infectious bacteria to assess the effectiveness of new antibacterial drugs. Many subjects who were taken up for these experiments died due to these experiments, while others suffered adverse consequences. Now, after the World War II, this was taken very seriously by the Allied forces. This was taken very seriously by the scientific community. And therefore, the trial of doctors was held at a place called Nuremberg, Germany, between December 9, 1946 to August 20, 1947. The guilty doctors were punished for their crime, and the world community adopted 10 points, and these 10 points for safety in research were called as Nuremberg Code for monitoring of scientific researchers involving human subjects. These 10 points, which were adopted after World War II, are very significant, I would say, in terms of the steps that were taken for protection of subjects, number one, and number two, adopting ethical principles in research in order to make research morally sound, in order to make research more responsible, in order to make research protecting human rights for the posterity. Now, these 10 Nuremberg Code are: number one, voluntary consent; number two, research be beneficial to the society; number three, any research on human beings succeed animal experimentations; four, unnecessary physical or mental injury must be avoided; fifth, no experiment should be done where death or injury may occur; sixth, the degree of risk should not exceed humanitarian importance in any research; seventh, adequate facilities and preparation of protect against death and injury; eighth, only scientifically qualified people should undertake experiments; ninth, Nuremberg Code, the participants have a right to leave participation; and lastly, the scientists in charge must be prepared to end the experiment if it is feared that it may result into possible death or injury. Now, after this, voluntary consent, which is very important now, that people should not be misled. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraints or coercions on part of the researchers. The duty and responsibility of ascertaining the quality of consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiments. And finally, it is a personal duty and responsibility which should not be delegated to another with impunity. In 1964, more refinements were done. We have what is called as the Helsinki Declaration. The Helsinki Declaration was adopted in order to facilitate human research, as Nuremberg Code did not distinguish between therapeutic clinical research and clinical research involving healthy humans. So therefore, it allowed participants in the research to have surrogate consent, where the actual participant is legally or physically unable to give consent. It distinguishes between clinical research combined with professional care and non-therapeutic clinical research. Then in 1976, we had what is called, world community adopted what is called as International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or abbreviated as Iccpr 1976. It was drafted by International Committee following World War II, although it was entered into force in the year 1976. In USA, the USA did not ratify it until 1992. So USA has a very, I think, bad record as far as the ethical researches are concerned. By 1997, 115 countries covering two-thirds of world's population had adopted Iccpr. Article 7 of the Iccpr states, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degraded treatment or punishment in particular, and in particular, no one shall be subjected without his or her consent to medical or scientific experiments. Now, what are the ethical considerations in general in research? Number one is proper identification. Code of ethics suggests that the researcher should give proper identification and avoid giving false impression of self or the sponsors. So, absolute honesty in terms of revealing the main purpose of research is absolutely essential. Clear outset. Researchers should inform the respondents of the type of questions, the possible consequences that the questioning and the research in general might have on the respondents. Thirdly, welfare of the respondents. The researcher should always be concerned with the welfare of the respondents, including mental, physical health, and safety. Researchers should avoid questions that may cause embarrassment, guilt, discomfort, hazard, or risk to the respondents. Then, free and informed consent. Researchers should participate in the research freely. Respondents should participate in the research freely and not be pressured to do so or deceived in any way. They should also be fully informed about the nature and goal of the study before they are asked to take part in the study. Right to privacy. Researchers should respect respondents' privacy when entering their private sphere and when asking questions, and should allow respondents to leave unanswered questions for which they do not wish to provide information. So you cannot demand answer to questions. Right to anonymity. Data collected by researchers should be anonymous, that is, not related to names or other forms of identification. In anthropology fieldwork, we are accustomed to what is called as pseudonym. Right to confidentiality. Information offered by the respondent should be used by the researcher only and only for the purpose of study. It should not be made available to other people or for any other reason or purpose. In any research which is ethically sound, informed consent is the core. That is declaring the purpose, that is making the informant aware of ins and out of the research. So therefore, generally speaking, informed consent is to be sought on a piece of paper by the literate informant or respondent signing it, and not so literate having a witness in front of whom the contents, the purpose, and the goal of research and its benefits and harms have been explained to the person. Now, therefore, now I will just discuss the structure. What should be the structure? What are the kind of questions that must be part of the informed consent? What is the purpose of the research? Then, what is the duration of the research? What will happen during the research? The procedure. What are the risks of the research? Then, what are the benefits of the research? What the study will cost to the participants, if any? What the participant will gain out of the study? Who is funding the study? Then confidentiality is too, the issues that it will be kept confidential. Then voluntary nature of the study, that the participant is given a choice to take part or not to take part, to continue or not to continue with the research. Then choice to drop out of the study must be made part of the informed consent, and the respondent must be informed of that. Then the right to ask questions about the study, that right also should be given to the respondents. And then it has to be signed. And in case of a child, in case of a illiterate person, then this can be of course signed by the witness. Now researcher is also supposed to be guided by professional consent. There is a professional conduct that is required from the researchers in doing research, in initiating research, in conducting collection of data, in writing of the research reports, and also in disseminating research. Now, what are the professional conducts which are required from researchers? One is misleading ascription of authorship. Researchers should not list authors in their report without their permission. Now, a very famous case happened with M.G.K. Menon, who was a very great scientist of India. He was an advisor to the Prime Minister, scientific advisor to the Prime Minister. In one of the papers that was published, in one of his authorships, there was an accusation of plagiarism, and therefore he had to tell that I was not aware of this study. My name was put inadvertently by the scholars who were, of course, his students, but he was not aware of the study, and that is what happened. Therefore, researchers should not list authors in the report without their permission. Should not attribute work to persons who have not contributed, and should attribute adequately work completed by students, trainees, or associates. Now, in many places it happens that people publish results, people publish papers, sometimes which are not written by them. Now, this is actually not a professional, this is not ethically correct. Then we have what is called as misuse of authority of role. Authority given by a researcher to a colleague should not be misused, and when criticizing work or research study of others, this should be guided by honesty, sincerity, justice, and responsibility, rather than by bias, polemics, or collective interest. Finally, in the professional conduct of researcher, we come to what is called as plagiarism. Very, very important part of professional conduct, ethical professional conduct. Researchers should abstain from using other people's work with appropriate acknowledgement. Now, therefore, what is required is plagiarism actually means, literal meaning of plagiarism is to kidnap. Now, what is kidnapped in plagiarism, in academic plagiarism or research plagiarism? People try to kidnap other people's knowledge. People try to kidnap other people's papers. And this is a very, very common practice in, of course, in places like, it is there everywhere, in America, in England, in Europe. But I think it is more in places where there are not many checks and balances. And it is less in those places where strict, rigorous checks and balances are there. Nowadays, plagiarism can be very easily found with the help of softwares. Now, it is a very common unethical conduct on part of the researchers, on part of the authors, on part of scientists. Plagiarism is the use of someone else's ideas or language without acknowledging that they were not created by you. This definition applies to ideas, words, and unusual structures, regardless of where you find them, in a book, on a web page, in an email. Whenever you include another person's information or wording in a document, you must acknowledge the source and include a citation that will tell your researchers or readers where you obtain it. Otherwise, you are guilty of plagiarism. Now, plagiarism has many dimensions. In fact, plagiarism can be ditto words. Plagiarism can sometimes be ideas of other people. That is also, again, plagiarism. Your own work, if you republish it in your authorship, will also be part of plagiarism. So plagiarism has a very wide ramifications. Now, research and politics are also very, very important, partners. And there is always what is called as conflict of interest issues, that there are funding agencies which sometimes influence and guide researches. There may be funding agencies who may promote a particular kind of medicine, researches on a particular kind of medicine, to make it scientifically validated so that it can be sold more. And therefore, scientists are always, in the danger of falling into the trap of these funding agencies, which sometimes lure them by means of giving them liberal funding. I must tell you here that as early as in 1964, when Indian Anthropological Association was formed, in Dalhousie there was a summer school, and in that summer school, leading anthropologists of India, they gathered there and they discussed precisely this issue of conflict of interest. And they said that when a researcher, even though he may be funded by a sponsoring funding by a sponsoring agency, the researcher should be on the side of science, not on the side of the funding agency or the funder. I think that was a great idea floated by our predecessor anthropologists in 1964. Conduct research often implies that results support the interest of the sponsor. For example, if a tobacco company sponsors the study on effect of smoking on cancer, now there will always be, a conflict of interest here. The clause of seeking permission of the sponsor before publishing the result can also prohibit dissemination of research. So therefore, nowadays many of the journals, they ask for declaration of conflict of interest. Who was the funding agency which supported? Is there any conflict of interest? And this has to be declared. And this has become a very, very important ethical considerations. Now, there is something called general ethical principles. All research involving human subjects should be conducted in accordance with three basic ethical principles, namely respect for person, beneficence, and justice. Respect of person incorporates at least two fundamental ethical considerations, namely respect for autonomy, which requires that those who are capable of deliberations about their personal choice should be treated with respect for their capacity for self-determination. And secondly, protection of persons with impaired or diminished autonomy, which requires that those who are dependent or vulnerable be afforded security against harm or abuse. Beneficence. Beneficence refers to ethical obligations to maximize benefits and to minimize harm. This principle gives rise to norms requiring that the risk of research be reasonable in the light of expected benefits, that the research design be sound, and that the investigators be competent both to conduct the research and to safeguard the welfare of the research subjects. Beneficence further prescribes the deliberate infliction of harm on persons. This aspect of beneficence is sometimes expressed as a separate principle: non-maleficence, do no harm. Finally, we come to justice. Justice refers to the ethical obligation to treat each person in accordance with what is morally right and proper, to give each person what is due to him or her. In the ethic of research involving human subjects, the principle refers primarily to distributive justice, which requires the equitable distribution of both the burdens and the benefits of participation in research. Now I come to a very important aspect of ethical issues in research. That is, nowadays all the researches have to go through what is called as Institutional Research Board, or IRB. Now IRBs are mandatory for a very long time as per the ICMR guidelines for medical researches, but this has been now extended to social sciences as well. Now IRBs are the review boards where a variety of experts sit together and they look at the ethical aspects, and then they give ethical clearance, or they may make certain objections if they feel that there is a violation of ethical principles, there is a violation of people's rights, there is a violation of there is some harm that may occur. So they accordingly give their suggestions to modify the research before it is given clearance. And many of the funding agencies nowadays do not accept a research for consideration unless it has cleared by institutional research review boards or IRBs. But what has happened when IRBs are, are extended to social sciences? There are some problems, and there are some genuine problems. Because IRBs are primarily constituted, primarily constructed, primarily structured on the basis of medical science researches. I told you Nuremberg Code and all those Helsinki declarations, they were all for medical researches. Later on, these were extended to social sciences as well. So social science researches in general are very skeptical of IRBs. They think that IRB is a kind of, is intrusion into their freedom of doing research. Some researchers see IRBs as handcuffs impeding them their search for scientific answers to social problems. Some researchers simply believe that IRBs tend to overstep their perceived purpose and limits. In India, many anthropological researches are especially concerned about high-handedness on part of IRBs. Some are genuine also. Some are genuine. Some are, of course, just like that, but some of these complaints are genuine. IRBs are staffed with clinicians unable to understand the nuances of social sciences styles of research. IRBs in general are perceived as villains by social scientists because IRBs generally are, lopsided, heavy on side of the clinical uh, specialists. Therefore, who look at things in a quantitative term. Therefore, it is very difficult for social scientists to convince them that there could be other ways of looking at the realities, because they always talk in terms of the sample size, always in terms of the sampling, or talk in terms of the questionnaire. So, what are the duties of IRBs? Assurance of informed consent is one of the important concerns of IRBs, of which social scientists have been extremely critical. Because informed consent is, for a questionnaire, it is good that you can take an informed consent. But for a fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork, there are different kind of nuances. Qualitative researchers, especially those involved in ethnographic research, have been particularly vocal. Their concerns often pertain to the way that formal requirements of institutional review board and written informed consent damage their special field worker informant relationship. The very nature of ethnographic research makes it ideal for studying secret, deviant, or difficult to study populations. Obtaining consent in such situations could be risky for ethnographers. Now, I'm talking of a constitution of IRBs, that is ICMR. According to it, there should be a chairperson, and the chairperson should be from outside the institution. Then there should be a member secretary, generally the head of the institution or high position holder from the institution. There should be a social scientist, there should be a medical expert, there should be a basic scientist, there should be a philosopher or theology expert, an NGO, there should be a legal expert, and there should be a lay person. So this is the kind of a ideal constitution of IRB for medical researches recommended by ICMR. Now, I just want to mention that there are problems that were faced by anthropologists. There are problems that anthropology researchers have, and therefore the national body of INCA, that is Indian National Confederation of Anthropology, and they have anthropological associations. That's the apex body of India. They decided to deliver upon these ethical concerns, especially for anthropological researches, and they have suggested and adopted in their Calcutta meeting a different constitution of IRB. I'll just read it to you, this constitution of IRB that is suitable for anthropologists. It should have a social scientist, sociologist, psychologist, social worker, one of them. This should have a biological scientist, geneticist, biotechnologist, or geologist. It should have a clinical scientist, preferably community medicine expert. It should have a philosopher, theology expert. It should have a biological anthropologist. It should have a social anthropologist. It should have an archaeological anthropologist. it should have an NGO representative, it should have a legal expert, and it should also have a member belonging to indigenous, marginalized community. And finally, it should have head of the department or senior staff as the member secretary. So anthropologists, because they are finding it very, very rigid and very, very difficult, they are coming out with their own institutional review boards, which could facilitate the anthropological researches and at the same time follow the basic principles of ethical research. So with these words, I would like to thank the organizers that they gave me this time. Thank you very much.